Hi, I will start by saying, Anjali, I think I have bad news for you. You were hoping that we will defend the premise that there is no backlash against globalization, but as we will see in this conversation, there are lots of trends that affect the business community, and we will unpack together. But before we do that, my name is Elena Chachko. I'm an assistant professor of law at Berkeley Law. I teach administrative law, but work extensively on matters of international economic regulation and economic statecraft. And I wanted to frame our conversation by highlighting three trend lines that we hope to cover in the Q&A. And after that, I will turn to our panelists, introduce them, and have them present their diverse viewpoints. So it's clear that there are many disruptive trends that affect the global environment in ways that also translate to the business community. One is the shift away from liberal trade policy. We see that with the Trump administration's realignment of US trade policy, the introduction of tariffs, the mercurial landscape in US trade policy, and everything that's brought. We're seeing greater rivalry between the US and China and other global actors. We're seeing a turn away from open borders, crackdown on immigration policies, making it harder for the business community to attract talent, and other developments along those lines. The second disruption that we are hoping to unpack here has to do with technology. And it's not news to anyone that AI and the quantum leap that occurred in that area in the last few years is dramatically changing the business landscape and creating both opportunities and risks that the business community has to contend with. And finally, there is a shift in the US approach to regulation associated with the Trump administration's attack on the administrative state and on regulation more broadly, and the difficulty in accessing federal funding in various areas, including national security priorities like cybersecurity. So our conversation will try to unpack all of those trends and how they affect the business environment in 40 minutes. So good luck with that. But before we start, I want to introduce my distinguished co-panelists. I'll go alphabetically. So we have Matt Cowcher, who is the Deputy General Counsel of TPG Capital, which is the large-scale private equity investment platform within TPG. Matt has worked in the US and Australia and has experience leading legal teams on a range of M&A transactions, including take-privates, LBOs, joint ventures, and other corporate partnering transactions. Michelle VonderHaar, to my immediate right, is the Chief Legal Officer of Tenable, which is a leader in cybersecurity that provides exposure management solutions to help organizations identify and reduce cyber risk across their entire attack surface. Michelle has 30+ years of broad legal experience, both as outside and in-house counsel in technology, living and working in the US, Europe, and Asia. Lisa Kaplan is the founder and CEO of Alethea, a company that detects and mitigates online risks stemming from narrative attacks, including short sellers, boycotts, brand reputation manipulation, threats of violence, activism, and cyber incident response. And finally, we have Lauren Odell, who is a partner and chief operating officer of Gladstone Place Partners, a strategic and financial communication firm headquartered in New York and serving global clients. Her work focuses on financial communications, including M&A and activism defense, as well as crisis and issues management and corporate governance communications. So as you can see, we have different perspectives from private equity, from founders, from the legal perspective and strategic communications addressing all of those topics. And the first question I want to ask you is, it's clear that all of these changes have generated substantial instability in the business environment. And my question to you is, how do you deal with it? How have your firms adjusted? What changes have you made? What has remained constant? And let me turn to Michelle to start us off.
Yeah, so I guess thank you, Elena, and it's good to be here and with all of you today. Given my cybersecurity background, I think I'll just start with focusing on that. The federal government's changes and disruption around DOGE and elimination of wholesale elimination of departments and uncertainty around procurements, and of course the government shutdown has put a lot of procurements as a whole and cybersecurity in particular on hold. So there's been a little bit of disruption there. There's also great state and local cybersecurity grant funding programs that enable states to really bolster their cybersecurity in reliance on federal programs. And that has now been cut off for a period of time, leaving states sort of having to fend for themselves without the budget that they had anticipated. And that has real world impacts. You may have seen, I think it was August or September, there was a ransomware attack in the state of Nevada. And it took weeks for them to get themselves up and running. And things like, the DMV being closed or things like that, it just has real world impacts to people on a day-to-day basis. So the disruption goes from the organizations all the way, to people on their day-to-day lives. And then for us as a cybersecurity vendor, it creates a great deal of uncertainty, I'm sure, as a software vendor and other technology players are, you forecast and you understand how things are supposed to be running, and you make predictions and budgets around that. And of course, you need to anticipate that things are going to evolve and change, and you prepare for that. But the change has been so rapid and in some cases jarring, with executive orders sort of coming out around daily, and you have to react to that. So I think we'll talk a little bit about sort of how organizations have adapted, but I guess I'll leave it there for the moment.
Excellent. Lauren, do you want to offer your perspective?
Thank you, and thank you so much, Elena, for having me today. As a communications firm, we are industry agnostic, but we have clients across the globe that touch basically every corner of the market. And this period of uncertainty and instability affects them different ways, and especially across different industries. So for example, clients in the pharma sector, they're dealing with requests from the administration to onshore some of their manufacturing. Something like that doesn't happen overnight. That's not a change that can happen quickly. It takes many years. And so our challenge as a communications firm is working with companies on how do they not only take some of these actions and respond to these changes, but also how do they communicate that as part of their long-term plan. For our clients in the tech sector, as we've discussed over the last day or so, changes in AI, clients are racing to take advantage of all of the possibilities that exist with AI, while also being aware of the risks and trying to build the infrastructure to support it. But at the same time, they're facing challenges in terms of talent and immigration policies that are hindering their ability to find the people to build the infrastructure and the products, including those who need H-1B visas. Clients in the manufacturing or building sector, also in terms of immigration, there are policies and security being put in place that are not only political issues around the increased scrutiny around immigration, but also security issues for their employees. And so I would say for the theme across the board is that it's not any one policy or issue, but the cumulative effect of creating this instability. It makes it very hard for companies to both plan for the long term and then also challenges for how they communicate their narrative.
Matt?
Yeah, I think it's funny, we were talking about this topic last week as a group, and the different ways of coming at this topic are sort of playing out. I think it's interesting. Sort of I guess I come to this panel as more of like the investing lens and the seat I sit in. It's been a very interesting time, obviously. I think you're hearing a common theme up here that's talking about stability. I think if you go back down the path of private equity, one of the main themes people have been focused on is there's some core assumptions people that get their arms around. It's frictionless capital, stable trade, predictable policy. And those key assumptions have been upended recently and changed. And that's the piece that people are really getting their arms around and trying to underwrite in deals as you go into a process, as you look at transactions, and also operationally for portfolio companies. I mean, I take the obvious example from my seat is obviously with tariffs. If you think back to early April, that was just a quick pendulum swing, and you had people on our deal teams calling us up on the Saturday, I think it was, when there were articles about it saying, how does this impact our business that has manufacturing sites in X, Y, and Z? And you had to get your arms around that really quickly. And I think we were hearing in the industry, there would be portfolio companies whose cost structures were upended overnight. Then, like their earnings margins were compressed. And if you think about sort of the private equity model of obviously you model out a case, you think about sort of the lifespan of a hold, for things to shift radically overnight, it's jarring for a lot of people, and that's the piece that people have really focused in on. And then I think more generally, if you think about the CFIUS role, for us that's a very big area of focus. I think for a long time, CFIUS, I obviously practiced at a law firm for a few years. I think CFIUS was, at the time, was thought of as more of it's obviously a closing issue, but people would get to it at that stage. Now it's from our seat, we front load that work. I mean, I could, tell that if there's law firm partners in the room, if they saw our work plan, that's something we front load. We go to our law firm partners and say, we need to understand the CFIUS profile of this deal, because that can drive so much within a transaction: deal structures, governance, terms, who the right partner is to invest alongside. And that's something we have invested a lot of time in, coming up with the right model, working with our frequent co-invest partners to understand what's going to be the right approach on the particular transaction. Because if you think about competitive processes, that can actually be a strategic advantage for investors. If you come to a process with a transaction that's particularly sensitive, and if you haven't looked around the corner of a CFIUS process, you come to a seller with a deal that has hairs on it, and that's going to pose problems. So the greater role, I think, of CFIUS in the deal making is also something that's become more pronounced. I think, Elena, you touched on this as well in terms of the immigration from a portfolio company perspective, the need for global talent and particularly for portfolio companies to compete for talent is becoming harder. When you're thinking about US businesses competing with global enterprises. So, I think there's a few themes there, but the sort of one of the main things, obviously, as well, is just the regulatory volatility. However you think about the swings, but when there are sudden swings, that can create friction in deals. That's just the reality. And when things happen overnight, people need to get their arms around it, whether it's less enforcement, more enforcement, pro-trade, protectionist. It's just a process people need to go through. So I think, overwhelmingly the impacts I've seen are more just trying to get our arms around the new world. And that's just, as people think about it, they think, look, this is the world we're in, and you just have to invest intelligently around it, is probably how I would think about it.
Great. Lisa, you're a founder trying to promote your company in this uncertain landscape. What are things like from your perspective?
Yeah, so we're a Series B company, and we weren't in the market at the time, but I did use the opportunity to write verbatim in a board memo. United presented 2 forecasts, so I'm presenting 2 forecasts too, which went over with mixed reviews. But I think for us, what we're seeing, because we're obviously seeing a lot of the same challenges that other companies are, but where we come in to support companies and the way that we're viewing it's just the rules of the game have changed. And I'll share a couple of quick examples that just highlight this. But for example, we are living in a world now where Laura Loomer is more influential than most senators. And I say that and it sounds ridiculous, and it is true. And so I do think that the rise of the influencer, the way that people communicate, how they value storytelling, and what risks it creates gets really messy really quickly. And we've seen more extremes due to just the proliferation of ways people interact and get their information and make decisions. So for example, 5% of the population is on True Social. that 5% is highly influential from a regulatory perspective. If you don't know what's being talked about on those platforms, do you really know what the conversations are that could potentially influence regulation? Should you be on those platforms? If you are, please make a Blue Sky account too. Otherwise, call me later. I think what's really important is understanding how those rules of the game have changed and what it means with this whiplash of changes in policy. And at this point, it's like almost offensive if your space hasn't received an executive order, like, do you matter? But we are, I think, living in a world where, and I'll just give one quick example. So, and I can't name names for obvious reasons, but we do a lot of, the way we work is we collect all this data, we've trained models, and I won't buzzword you to death, to basically pull out what's out there, who's behind it, how is it spreading, what type of risk is it creating, and what can you do about it. We caught a network of Russian propaganda network coming from the GRU. I am old school in that if a foreign military is talking about your company or your products, that's bad. And you should do something about that. And so what we ended up seeing was this network was essentially alleging that there were all these challenges with the F-35. Because if you don't have a response to it from a military perspective and you can't beat it in the airspace, just beat it in US political discourse and don't get that thing funded in NDAA season. So we started seeing all of these narratives that were gaining traction. They were starting to influence what information was coming out of LLMs. Now think about how you use LLMs, the different contracts that have been awarded to different parts of government for access to which LLMs. And they were alleging that the program, and as somebody who has worked on it, not the world's best run program, but that the program was mismanaged. Why are we funding this? We have all these issues here at home. This money needs to be on the border, essentially amplifying what is First Amendment protected speech. So you're already dealing with a situation where it's not actually a Russian narrative, but the Russians are playing in this space. Then what happens is it starts to influence certain members of Congress. It starts entering the discourse. It starts being picked up by traditional media. There are certain elements of logos being used, executives being targeted that can open up the opportunity for legal action. But then what was really fascinating to me is one of our partners shared that at the Paris Air Show, where it's like if you're in defense or if you're in the military, you're in Paris in the spring. That they were having conversations with NATO partners during bilat saying, well, can we really buy the F-35 or are you guys going to use the kill switch? By the way, the kill switch is completely fabricated and started as Russian propaganda saying that the US can turn it on and turn it off at any given time, but that's now going to impact sales. And so I think what this means in terms of how is the world changing, no matter what we're talking about in terms of the geopolitical rebalance, the different issues that are prominent, it's how do you play the game and how do you know that the rules of the game have changed in terms of being able to protect ultimately shareholder value, but reputation, physical safety, regulatory concerns, et cetera. And that's a lot of what we're helping companies navigate.
Great, so that's
I'm no longer presenting two forecasts. I'm not allowed to do that.
Great, so you've all touched on the sensation that the rules of the game are changing, that things that used to be in the margins are now at the center of your work. CFIUS, new challenges on platforms and the like, new challenges in strategic communications, new challenges in how you approach deals and how you approach your work. And if you had to identify one thing that you're doing differently now than you did, say, 10 years ago, what would it be? What was the most dramatic change in the way your businesses and the way your ventures and the way your line of work has been affected? So Lisa, I'll start with you this time and we'll go in reverse.
So we didn't exist 10 years ago,
Yeah.
but we're 6.5 years old. Sometimes we act like it. The thing that I would say has probably changed the most is just how we think about risk and how teams are really coming together. So it's more the Tiger team that comes together in a crisis is coming together proactively to proactively manage risk and reduce exposure. One more quick example, we work with a Fortune, 50, 100, and they did a CNBC hit, comms team knocked it out of the park. It then started being talked about in very small political circles, amplified by fake accounts. Fake accounts got taken down by security. Then they got a call from the White House being like, please correct this, which, you have to then sit there and say, is it insane that the White House is asking us to put a statement, or do we just do it because who cares? They opted to do it, and then it got kind of swallowed up, and they then had to protect against, like, okay, how are we marketing to people who don't necessarily agree with the White House and making sure that they stay our customers and we don't get boycotted because we're a B2C company. That series of events happening in a 24-hour period would have been unthinkable probably 10 years ago, but we've seen that teams have to figure out how to work together faster and think about the multiple dimensions of operating a business today that just weren't as acute then.
Matt?
Yeah, I think if you go back even sort of a few decades in terms of how private equity's thought about some of these matters, geopolitical considerations, issues, for a lot of private equity firms, I would say investing out of the US, it was something to monitor, but it was a bit of background noise. It was, there are obviously exceptions if you're investing in certain high-risk jurisdictions, but by and large, it wasn't given the same prominence it is now. And I think about our processes internally, there is so much more at the start of a deal teams are building in and trying to understand very early on the exposure to different geopolitical factors, trade controls, sanctions, things of that nature. And that's got to be built into the model. That's fundamentally what deal teams are having to do now, because they get to investment committee and people are no longer, there are obviously the questions you used to get, which are like market risk and things around that, more macro, but then now people are going, but what's the policy risk here? This particular company in this particular sector in this particular jurisdiction, what do we need to be thinking about? And so deal teams need to come prepared for that. And obviously in our seat, or in my seat, that's a large role, is to help our teams understand where the winds are blowing, what could be around the corner. And that's just something that we've all had to get our arms around. So I think that's a large piece of it. I think obviously I touched on it briefly in terms of like the structuring of your investment. That is, it's no longer just about capital alignment or financial fit. You need to come to a deal with a partner who understands the sensitivities, who can execute on the deal in the way that you're thinking about it. And so there's so much more forethought into that part of a deal as well, I think, and we brainstorm, and I sort of touched on this, different models with different co-invest partners. So I think that's the large piece, and I think, more generally, there's just a sense of trying to invest in a way that you now, I guess stepping back, within TPG particularly, there are thematic investors, so people focus on different themes. And so they dive deep into the detail, and this is now such a core part of that within so many different areas of the different industries. So it's upskilling, it's training people, it's just that piece of it, I think, is now where there's a lot more focus.
Lauren?
So for our clients, again, they're large, global, generally publicly traded companies. They have, they've dealt with various administrations over decades. So yes, some of this is new, but some of it is also not new. And thinking about how to deal with each administration is something that companies have been doing, since they began. So what's different? I think over the last couple of years, we've definitely seen companies less willing to be out there in a major way, opining on something political or something potentially controversial or something in general that just doesn't pertain to their business. You don't want to sort of raise your head above the pulpit unnecessarily and get criticized for something that you can avoid. That makes sense. We have definitely seen more companies engaging with the administration, engaging with going to the White House. If the White House calls, you don't say no thanks. And that's something that is definitely happening across the board, across industries. And then something else that's been interesting is that all communications now are global, and you need to have consistent messaging. You need to say the same thing no matter what audience you're talking to. But that being said, many of our clients are spending a lot of time thinking about local communities, and it may be to regions of the globe that different messages resonate in different ways in different parts of the world, but it could also be within our own country, that different regions of the United States, you need to think about what is it that you're saying, how are you delivering the message, and companies are adapting in real time. So, again, everyone's adapting in different ways, but again, going back to my earlier point, they're sort of taking lessons that they've learned throughout the years.
Michelle?
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to just kind of play off a little bit of what you said, which is the way I'm kind of looking at it from an in-house counsel perspective is stay rooted in what you can control. Because there's so many things out there that there's so much churn and flurry and disinformation, and you've got to stay rooted in what you can control and then plan for the things that you know are going to happen, the inevitable things. And how do you do that? Well, you set up, most companies will have their standard policies and processes, but for example, most companies now will have an AI governance council, for example, and you evaluate the AI tools before you use them internally. And the way that we would typically look at new software that would come into play is the information security team would just make sure that it had certain checks, ISO and whatever the security checks were. You can't do the same thing anymore with AI. And so recently I've learned, we were testing an AI model and it had access to certain things that people had, limited amount of access control to. But when our security team tested it, there was just holes everywhere. And so the old security methods that worked in the past are no longer going to work. So you need to think about, okay, what are the things that we're doing today, and think, okay, what should we be doing differently? What should we be testing for? What are the other things that we should be looking for? And have that sort of constant loop and questioning, because it's no longer a check the box exercise. You have to stay vigilant because things are happening on a daily basis. Right now we know there's talks going on in China that could completely change trade policy tomorrow, and it might create some opportunities for Matt to go acquire other companies, and yet at the same time it's just so much uncertainty. So like Matt said earlier, planning ahead, making sure that, we just had a session a little bit ago on data leaks and breaches. Plan ahead. Lauren, you prepare companies for, doing tabletop exercises and the like for data leaks and breaches and the like. And you have to have a plan. You have to have a decision tree. You have to know who to go to. Sometimes it's tiger teams that just form and it works really well because you get all the right experts together. And you still have to do that. But having a plan A and maybe a plan B, I actually like the fact that you had 2 plans for your company. I think it's smart. You've got a plan A if these things happen and a plan B if that happens. But then you need to be vigilant because maybe neither plan A or plan B are going to address the situation, but at least you've already started the thinking about it and you're better prepared. So I think just really constantly being vigilant about the environment and the changes. And I also agree with you, Matt. 10 years ago, for a deal, you didn't really think about putting CFIUS or regulatory things up front. It was sort of a perfunctory thing that you dealt with on the back end. Now you really have to be vigilant about these things. And it's exciting, and it's also keeps you on your toes.
It is exciting. And I will one anecdote. I started looking at sanctions and CFIUS and that kind of thing about 10 years ago when there were 10 people who dealt with it. The practices within law firms were small to non-existent. Now it's a booming field. So I tell my students, if you're looking for legal work in the national security space, it's a whole lot of opportunity for you out there.
I should have come to you 10 years ago. That's so true.
10 years ago, I wouldn't have been there. But the point is, this is a growing area of work for lawyers, for investors, for people to gain a better understanding of these geopolitical instruments that used to be on the margins and again are now front and center. Another thing I thought was very interesting, Lauren, you said there's a lot of continuity too. businesses have dealt with drastic changes in the political environment in the past, and there are things that are constant from that perspective. But still, it's hard to deny, listening to all of you, that things are changing substantially in ways that are important across the different aspects of what you do. But now I want to look forward and think about the future and ask you, if you could make one thing disappear, if you can make one thing return to the way it used to be, that would be a massive relief for you, that would improve your life tremendously, that would make it easier for you to either promote your company or advise your companies or engage with investment and that environment, what would that be? And I'll start with Lauren this time.
Okay, I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna do two.
Do two.
So the first I would have all of our clients actually do all of the prep work before and engage and think about all of the possible things that could happen, because what happens is when you're preparing for a crisis or an issue or some sort of risk, you figure out, well, we did this really well and we did this pretty terribly, and you figure out who's gonna lead. You're not all staring at each other in the room like, sort of like sitting ducks, and figuring out how it's going to go. And if you do that, you're just, you're 50% of the way there if and when something happens, and something always happens. So we've worked with clients where we start preparing on the day the crisis happens, and we've done it where we prepare years in advance, and it definitely goes better if you thought about it before. The second thing is, like Matt, we do a lot of M&A, and so anything that stabilizes the economy, whether it's stability in tariffs, whether it's lower interest rates, whether it's more lenient antitrust. We love all of those things, but really it's about stability and companies feeling like they're ready to take on transformative change, and they're also ready to plan for the future and tell that go forward narrative, and that in turn then makes our job easier.
Matt, why would you make disappear?
Well, that's a broad question. Look, I think if you were to ask an investor sitting in my seat what they'd be focused on, it's really what Lauren was saying, which is stability. I think what people are looking for is to be able to look out over a short-term, medium-term, longer-term horizon and understand where things are headed. That is not necessarily saying policy has to be pro-trade or protectionist. It's not that. It's just purely understanding which way, if I invest a 3-5 year horizon, what am I going to be looking at? Particularly on things like tariffs. If there's some stability around that, people understand and go into a transaction and they can model that out, and it trends back towards those stable set of assumptions I was sort of touching on at the start. So I think that's one piece, and that's more of a thematic than like any particular point. I think one thing, and it feels like I probably should say it up here, is around AI. One piece that's quite interesting around that is you're seeing different sets of rules around AI globally. And that is particularly challenging with people who invest in companies that have global operations. So it creates almost, by the fact you have different rules you'll have US, Europe, Asia rules, it creates almost a regulatory sort of fragmentation or digital borders, however you want to think about it, that a business model that may work in the US won't necessarily work in Europe or in Asia. Mm-hmm. And the speed at which AI is moving, if you're not on the bus, you're falling behind. That is a challenge that people are really trying to get their arms around. So I think more uniform, it's a wish of more than anything, but I think if there's more uniformity around that, I think that'll make a big difference. And I think more generally, look, it's an interesting time. I think we've all made the point. It's a time of a lot of change. But if you're able to get your arms around the world we're in now, it does provide, at least in my world, a competitive advantage for people. The firms, the investors who are able to understand the world, to come to grips with where the challenges are and invest behind that, I think they're the firms who are going to really do well in the short term. But I think sort of what I was touching on around the stability and the AI piece in particular is something that comes to mind.
Lisa, what's on your wish list?
Oh man, and I only get one. For people to be nice online. Since people aren't going to be nice to each other online, I would say it's two things. So first, At the same time, we're all investing in AI and it is exciting. This is where like I kill a lot of salon dinners, because if any of us have agents making material decisions for the business, we are not getting insurance. So I think having some level of like realistic expectation of how long this is going to take to get it right, for all of the reasons we were just talking about, in terms of like, and not to bring us back to when we were all moving into the cloud and the conversation was like, but our data and security and privacy and accessibility, because it's the same exact Mad Lib right now in the security world, except instead of cloud, we're saying AI and agents. So I think just a recognition that this is coming and that it could be really bad, but we have an opportunity to get it right for all of the dynamics that we're talking about, in a way that we've never been able to do it before with any sort of next iteration of technology. The second thing I would say is, I think that a lot of organizations are starting to get there, but the realization that the idea of risk and security is rapidly changing, and it's no longer just the CISO that's responsible for it. You really can't have a meaningful conversation around any of the topics we've just discussed with just one function in an organization. So we're seeing movement towards that more collaborative, like let's figure out how to manage this risk and game of who's got the ball. But we're still operating in a really siloed way, even for organizations that are really leading that collaborative approach.
Well, I'll close us off with a couple of things. One is, I'm just going to link onto what you just said, Lisa, around CISOs. And I actually think that elevating CISOs in organizations is really, really important, and have them be more executive level so that they have broader scope and understanding across the organization. And then there's just a couple of themes that I wanted to pull on, because it's probably more than just one, because there's so many. But the other is on the stability front. If we had some predictability in terms of how policies are made, how laws are made, and how how they would be adjudicated, which all seems to be kind of, we don't know. And so that environment of stability, I think having that precision would be really helpful. And then last, from a US perspective and a global perspective, how do we remain as a leader? Well, we need to invest in education. We need to invest in technology and get more people on the technology side educated here, allowing for better immigration policies to enable us to get the best talent, because we have been the leader in globally in technology, and to remain there, we need to be able to attract the best talent wherever that is. And then lastly, I would say, we should enter into sort of public-private partnerships with the US government so that we can, really help with that clarity and stability.
Excellent. So this has been fascinating. And I don't want to end on an entirely bleak note. So I'm going to try to pull out some positives from some of your answers just now. Everyone wants more stability. Everyone wants to know how policies are made. Everybody wants more predictability. That's clear. It's clear that it's incredibly disruptive and makes it much harder to function as a business actor. But some of you have raised the point that it also creates disruption, that it is generative. So yes, lots of pre-existing ways of doing things, lots of pre-existing approaches to problems are being undermined. But we're hearing that new solutions are coming up, like realigning organizational structures to try to bring all of the different risks, considerations that are related to these shifts in the global environment into the boardroom and into conversation around policy and around business. So that's something that is a silver lining, I think. And really having the opportunity to reconsider, to rethink our approach, our collective approach to problems like AI, like trade policy. People agree that tariffs are bad and disruptive, but the status quo pre-tariffs wasn't great either. So maybe that's an opportunity to rethink how the US approaches that. Of course, it's not all rosy. It's hard to cast some policies in a positive light, but I thought it would be useful to end on this note that this is an opportunity for new ideas to be generated and for new conversations to get started. So please join me in thanking our terrific panelists for sharing their views today.
Thank you.